Yesterday, September 18th, 2025, the world witnessed the birth of what could fundamentally reshape global power dynamics for decades to come. In Riyadh, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan signed a mutual defense pact that goes far beyond typical diplomatic ceremonies. At the United Nations in New York, America cast its sixth veto against a Gaza ceasefire resolution, standing alone against the entire international community once again. In Tel Aviv, Yemeni drones pierced Israeli air defenses, demonstrating that regional military superiority is no longer guaranteed. And in Beijing, China condemned Israeli strikes while positioning itself as the champion of international law that America has abandoned. On Wednesday, September 17, 2025, in a gilded palace in Riyadh, something extraordinary happened. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman embraced Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif after signing what can only be described as a game-changing mutual defense pact. Now, before you dismiss this as just another diplomatic handshake, let me spell out exactly what this means. This isn't just any defense agreement. This is a formal treaty that explicitly states that any attack on either Saudi Arabia or Pakistan will be considered an attack on both nations. Both nations. Think about that for a moment. Pakistan, let me remind you, is a nuclear-armed nation. Pakistan has somewhere between 165 to 170 nuclear warheads in its arsenal. Saudi Arabia, meanwhile, has the world's largest oil reserves and has been quietly building one of the most sophisticated military arsenals in the Middle East, funded by decades of petrodollar wealth. When these two nations sign a mutual defense pact, when they pledge to treat an attack on one as an attack on both, we're not talking about a ceremonial agreement. We're talking about the foundation of what could very well be the beginning of a Muslim NATO, a defensive alliance that fundamentally reshapes the balance of power, not just in the Middle East, but globally. And the timing is everything. This pact comes in the immediate aftermath of Israel's strike on Hamas leadership in Qatar, an operation that sent shockwaves through the Gulf states and reminded them all of something they'd rather not think about, that their supposed American security umbrella might not be as reliable as they once thought. For decades, Gulf Arab states have relied on American security guarantees, American military bases, American protection. But what happens when America's interests don't align with yours? What happens when America's unconditional support for Israel puts you in the crosshairs? This Saudi-Pakistan defense pact isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening as Gulf Arab states are increasingly questioning whether they can count on Washington when push comes to shove. It's happening as they watch America veto ceasefire after ceasefire in Gaza, while their own populations grow increasingly angry about Palestinian suffering. It's happening as they realize that America's Middle East policy is driven not by regional stability, but by domestic political considerations that prioritize Israel above all else. The agreement goes far beyond just mutual defense. We're talking about defense industry collaboration, technology transfer, military co-production, capacity building, and training. In other words, Saudi Arabia is not just allying itself with Pakistan's military might, it's gaining access to Pakistan's nuclear technology ecosystem. Now, let me be clear, there's no evidence that nuclear weapons are part of this deal. But when a non-nuclear state signs a comprehensive defense pact with a nuclear state, the strategic calculus changes for everyone in the region. And speaking of that strategic calculus, let's talk about what happened yesterday at the United Nations Security Council, because it perfectly illustrates why countries like Saudi Arabia are looking for alternatives to American protection. For the sixth time since this Gaza war began, nearly 2 years ago, the United States vetoed a UN Security Council resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. 6 times. Let that sink in. While children are starving in Gaza, while humanitarian organizations are confirming that famine has arrived in Gaza, America stood alone against the entire world and said no to peace. 14 out of 15 Security Council members voted for this ceasefire resolution. 14. The entire world, including America's closest allies, supported an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire. But America stood alone and vetoed it. Again, because apparently Israel's right to continue its military operations is more important than Palestinian children's right to eat, to live, to exist. The American representative gave the usual talking points about Israel's right to defend itself, about the need for Hamas to release hostages first, about the complexity of the situation. But here's what they didn't say. They didn't explain why America is the only country on earth that thinks the systematic starvation of 2 million people is acceptable collateral damage. They didn't explain why America is the only country that thinks 14 months of bombardment, displacement, and destruction isn't enough. They didn't explain why American weapons continuing to kill Palestinian civilians is more important than international law, human rights, or basic human decency. This is why the Saudi-Pakistan Defense Pact matters. This is why we might be witnessing the birth of a Muslim NATO. Because when you watch America use its veto power 6 times to enable what international organizations are calling war crimes, when you watch America isolate itself from the entire international community to protect Israel's ability to continue bombing Gaza, you start to ask yourself a very simple question. If America will sacrifice Palestinian lives for Israeli interests, what makes you think they won't sacrifice your lives for Israeli interests? The Saudis are asking that question. The Pakistanis are asking that question. And increasingly, the answer is driving them to seek security arrangements that don't depend on American goodwill or American interests aligning with theirs. But let's zoom out even further, because there's another player in this story that's been making moves that are absolutely fascinating to watch. China. Yes, China. While America was busy vetoing ceasefire resolutions and providing diplomatic cover for Israel's military operations, China has been positioning itself as the voice of reason, the advocate for international law, the defender of Palestinian rights. Yesterday, after Israel conducted a strike in Doha, yes, Doha, the capital of Qatar, a supposed American ally, China immediately condemned the attack and warned about escalation. China didn't just issue a diplomatic statement, they actively worked to organize international pressure against Israel. Prime Minister Netanyahu, clearly rattled by Beijing's diplomatic offensive, actually accused China of organizing a media blockade against Israel. A media blockade. As if China controls global media coverage of Israeli actions in Gaza. China, predictably, rejected Netanyahu's claims as groundless. But here's what's really happening. Beijing is seizing the opportunity that America's unwavering support for Israel has created. While America isolates itself at the UN, China positions itself as the champion of international law. While America provides weapons for Israeli military operations, China calls for adherence to Geneva Conventions. While America vetoes ceasefire resolutions, China supports diplomatic solutions. This isn't just about Palestine or Israel. This is about global influence, about who gets to shape international norms, about who the developing world sees as their advocate versus who they see as their oppressor. And right now, America's position on Gaza is doing more to advance Chinese influence in the global south than any Belt and Road Initiative project ever could. The most telling moment came when a Chinese scholar directly confronted an Israeli diplomat over Gaza's civilian deaths. Not in some backroom diplomatic meeting, but publicly, forcefully, making the case that Israel's actions violate international humanitarian law. When was the last time you saw an American scholar publicly confront Israeli officials over Palestinian casualties? When was the last time American academics felt free to challenge Israeli policy without facing career consequences? China is studying this moment, learning from America's mistakes, positioning itself as the alternative to American hegemony, and countries are taking notice. When Saudi Arabia signs defense pacts with Pakistan instead of relying on American security guarantees, when Gulf states start hedging their bets with Beijing instead of trusting Washington, when the developing world increasingly sees America as the enabler of Israeli war crimes rather than the champion of international law. That's not just a Middle Eastern story. That's a story about the decline of American global leadership. The studies that have emerged this week about China expanding its influence campaigns targeting both Israel and the United States aren't surprising. They're inevitable. When you create a vacuum of moral leadership, someone else fills it. When you isolate yourself from international opinion, someone else becomes the voice of the international community. When you prioritize the interests of one country over the rights of entire populations, someone else becomes the champion of the oppressed. But let's talk about what's happening inside America itself, because even American public opinion is shifting in ways that should terrify the political establishment. New polling shows a growing number of Americans believe the United States supports Israel too much. Not too little, not just enough, but too much. This represents a seismic shift in American public opinion that the political class is desperately trying to ignore. For decades, unconditional support for Israel was considered the third rail of American politics. Touch it and your political career dies. But something fundamental has changed. Americans are watching the footage from Gaza. They're seeing the children. They're seeing the destruction. They're seeing America providing the weapons, the diplomatic cover, the financial support that makes it all possible. And they're asking questions that their representatives are desperately trying not to answer. Secretary of State Marco Rubio's recent visit to Israel perfectly encapsulates this disconnect. While American public opinion shifts, while the international community demands accountability, while even America's allies express frustration with Israeli actions, Rubio visits Israel to reassure them of America's continued support. The optics couldn't be worse. America's top diplomat traveling to Jerusalem to pledge continued support, while America stands alone at the UN vetoing ceasefire resolutions. This is the context in which the Saudi-Pakistan Defense Pact makes perfect sense. This is the environment in which Muslim nations are asking themselves whether they can rely on an America that prioritizes Israeli interests above international law, above human rights, above the lives of Muslim civilians. This is why we might be witnessing not just a bilateral defense agreement, but the foundation of an entirely new security architecture in the Muslim world. The implications are staggering. Pakistan's nuclear capabilities combined with Saudi financial resources and regional influence creates a power center that doesn't exist under American oversight or control. Add to that potential partnerships with other Muslim nations who are equally frustrated with American policy: Turkey, Iran, Malaysia, Indonesia, and you're talking about a bloc representing over 1 billion Muslims with significant military capabilities, economic resources, and geographic reach. This isn't about anti-American sentiment for its own sake. This is about Muslim nations recognizing that America's Middle East policy is fundamentally incompatible with their interests, their values, and their security needs. When America uses its UN Security Council veto power to enable the starvation of Muslim civilians in Gaza, when America provides weapons that kill Muslim children in Palestine, when America diplomatically shields Israel from accountability for violations of international law, Muslim nations start asking themselves a very reasonable question: why should we depend on America for our security? The Saudi-Pakistan Defense Pact is their answer. It's a hedge against American unreliability. It's an insurance policy against American abandonment. It's a recognition that in a world where America prioritizes Israeli interests above all else, Muslim nations need alternative security arrangements. The timing of Yemen's drone attack on Tel Aviv, which occurred just as these diplomatic realignments are taking place, isn't coincidental either. The Houthis in Yemen have been conducting increasingly sophisticated attacks on Israeli targets, demonstrating capabilities that worry not just Israel, but also the broader regional security establishment. These attacks represent more than just military operations. They represent a challenge to the entire regional order that America has tried to maintain. When Yemeni forces can successfully strike targets in Tel Aviv, it demonstrates that Israel's military superiority isn't absolute, that American weapon systems aren't impenetrable, that the regional balance of power is shifting in ways that traditional security arrangements can't address. This is why Saudi Arabia, despite its own conflict with the Houthis in Yemen, is signing defense pacts with Pakistan, rather than relying solely on American protection. The interconnectedness of these events, the Saudi-Pakistan Pact, America's 6th UN veto, China's diplomatic offensive shifting American public opinion, Yemeni attacks on Israel, Marco Rubio's damage control visit to Jerusalem tells a story about a world in transition, about old alliances cracking under new pressures, about the consequences of prioritizing one relationship above all others. America's political establishment keeps telling itself that unconditional support for Israel strengthens American influence in the Middle East. But look around. Look at what's actually happening. Muslim nations are forming alternative security arrangements. China is positioning itself as the champion of international law. American allies are expressing public frustration with American policy. American public opinion is shifting away from Israeli support. The UN Security Council repeatedly votes 14-1 against American positions. This is what decline looks like. Not sudden collapse, but gradual isolation, diminishing influence, allies hedging their bets, alternative power centers emerging to fill the vacuum you've created through your own choices. Consider the practical implications of this Saudi-Pakistani alliance. This partnership creates technology transfer programs that could fundamentally alter the regional balance of power. Pakistan brings to this partnership something that no other Muslim nation possesses: a mature nuclear weapons program with delivery capabilities that span the entire Middle East and beyond. When Saudi Arabia allies itself with Pakistan's nuclear capabilities, the strategic calculus for every country in the region changes overnight. But Pakistan isn't just bringing nuclear capabilities, it's bringing decades of experience fighting asymmetric warfare, counterterrorism expertise, and complete independence from American military doctrine and American weapon systems. Pakistan has been developing indigenous defense capabilities precisely because it learned that dependence on American weapons comes with American strings attached. Saudi Arabia has learned the same lesson through different experiences. Despite spending hundreds of billions on American weapons systems, despite hosting American military bases, despite serving as America's primary Middle Eastern ally after Israel, the Saudis have watched America prioritize Israeli interests over Saudi interests repeatedly. This defense pact is Saudi Arabia's declaration of independence from American security guarantees that have proven unreliable. It's Pakistan's opportunity to expand its strategic influence beyond South Asia. But more than that, it's the foundation for what intelligence agencies are now describing as a Muslim NATO, a defensive alliance that could eventually include Turkey, Iran, Malaysia, Indonesia, and other Muslim majority nations frustrated with American double standards. The sophistication of Yemeni drone operations reveals something that should concern American strategists: the proliferation of advanced military capabilities beyond American control. The Houthis didn't develop these technologies independently. They received support and technology transfer from Iran, which has been developing indigenous defense capabilities specifically to counter American and Israeli military advantages. This technology transfer represents the future of the emerging Muslim defense architecture. Instead of depending on American weapons with American strings, instead of relying on American approval for military operations, Muslim nations are developing indigenous capabilities, sharing technology among themselves, and creating defense partnerships that operate independently of American interests. China's role in facilitating these alternative arrangements cannot be overstated. Beijing has been building economic infrastructure, financial systems, and trade relationships that allow nations to operate independently of American-dominated international institutions. When Muslim nations like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan form defense partnerships, they're building the foundation for a multipolar world order that doesn't revolve around American interests. This is the world that America's Gaza policy has created. This is the future that 6 UN vetoes have guaranteed. This is the price of unconditional Israeli support, not just Palestinian lives, but American influence, American alliances, and America's ability to shape international events. The Muslim NATO isn't a response to American strength, it's a response to American moral bankruptcy and diplomatic isolation.